Um, Thank you. Just so you know, what we're going to talk about came out of really some frustration. Just a little bit about my background, and then we'll talk about how we got into some of these initiatives. Uh, I came right out when I came out of college. I needed a job, and I became a child care worker at a juvenile detention center, girls and boys, and the girls gave me all I could handle, and I had to go to the boys unit. Learned a lot, became the school teacher there, became the director there, became a probation officer for 15 years in the third busiest court in Massachusetts, and then was lucky enough to be recruited or asked to apply for a job at the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office for a gentleman by the name of Mike Sullivan, who later became U.S. Attorney and um, and then head of ATF as well. He said to me when he brought me on, he said, I got 70 people in who attorneys and staff who put people in jail, prison, probation, etc. But I got nobody on the front end. And I really want you to do some prevention work. Um, so I was pretty excited about doing that, but I didn't know really where to go. So I was looking at best practices. We were looking at gang, how do we work with gangs? How do we get guns off the street? The city that was the main one in Plymouth County was a city called Brockton. It's a industrial town, formerly famous for its shoes, but has since seen better days. Became really a gateway city, as we say, and the population changed quite dramatically in the last, say, 30 years. And with that came, unfortunately, a lot of poverty and also a lot of crime. And so they also had the third largest school system in the Commonwealth. So when I was at the DA's office, I was really looking for how can we address some of these issues with kids. Really needed to do a drill down, and so some of that kind of fell into my lap. I mean, you'll probably figure it out. I'm not the necessarily sharpest knife in the drawer here, but I kind of sometimes things fall into your lap, and you can kind of say, "Wait a minute, this is something we ought to follow up on." So those of you who know, let me see if I can get this. We're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences, which surprisingly, I bet if I asked this question 20 years ago when it first came out, no one knew because very few people did. And then 10 years ago, there'd be a number of people who would. Now, 5 years even, uh, there's not a lot of people who kind of followed it, et cetera. But I bet now most of the people in this have an understanding of it. We're just going to quickly go through it. I think it's important because I think what it does is it shows other people, first responders, school personnel, human service workers, the nature and the extent of the problem. And I also want to talk about adverse childhood experiences, but also local ACEs, if you will. And then we're going to talk about how frontline responders can help. At some point down the line, I think we ought to mention a program that I was lucky enough to be involved with, kind of initiating, which was the Handle with Care model coming out of West Virginia, and we can talk about that as well. So again, many of you know that Kaiser Permanente, Vince Felitti and Robert Anda from the CDC and Vince Felitti from Kaiser Permanente had similar views of that maybe this could be what are the long-term health outcomes of folks in their 50s and 60s who had experience in adverse childhood experience. And again, you may know some of those, et cetera. And here they are: emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mother treated violently, excuse me, substance abuse, mental health, separation, divorce. And again, the other two, and I'm kind of going off on. All right. Excuse me one second. One of the things I would say is that when this is from the original study, it's been replicated in a number of places, as you probably know. One of the places it was also done was in inner city Philadelphia. This study was done mainly from 17,000 folks in their 50s and 60s, 70% white, 70% with some college education. When this study was completed in Philadelphia inner city, again, mainly minority populations, the numbers were far greater than this. But if you just take a look, I think about the idea of substance abuse, at the time, it was 27%. But I think that given everything we're all going through with opioids, et cetera, I would imagine that number is higher. I know we see it in Massachusetts in regards to the number of overdoses, the number of kids who are in state custody, the number of children who are parents are having their parental rights terminated, et cetera. So I think that number's quite higher. But I think when you show people these numbers, it's important for them to understand the prevalence and exactly how much. So we also, again, these are other ACEs that weren't necessarily in the original study. One of the things that I think what we did was I had some time and some funding with a weed and seed grant. And I asked our researchers to say, show me all the police reports in the city of Brockton for a 6 month period where children were present when a violent event took place or they were victimized. And then give me the next 6 months. So in 6 months, I had a year's worth of data. And I think the data is super important because you can tell people anecdotal stories, and I think they're really important. But I also think you got to hit them over the head with the sheer numbers. And so, for instance, that first year, we brought it to the Brockton police and said, hey, after 6 months, we crunched the data. And we saw that of all the arrests they were making, about 850 involved children where there was a violent event that took place. Now, there's 17,000 kids in the school system, so you can kind of do the math there. When we did a focus group with those police officers, one of the things we found that was pretty clear was they were kind of sitting squirming in their chair. And one of them said to me, can we talk to you afterwards? I had a friend of mine who was a sergeant and a couple other patrolmen, and they said, I got to tell you, we don't always put the kids in the police report. And I said, why don't you do that? And they said, well, the mother's a nice lady, CPS doesn't really need to be involved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we said, listen, we really had to retrain them, A, for the matter of their mandated reporters, but B, if we were going to do anything, we needed to identify these children and figure out how we were going to reach out to them. That following year, it went from 850 to 1,350. So we're starting now to get police officers to say, wait a minute, I'm looking around the scene and I'm starting to notice things. And the other thing that came out that was real clear to me, that was really important to me, was that police officers were saying, Ed, I get to the scene and I clear the scene, or I create zones of safety, et cetera. But I look in the corner and I see a 5-year-old boy or girl and they're sucking their thumb and they're rocking back and forth. And I don't know what to do for them. And so that became something that we really needed to take a look at. And again, you probably know the data, but I think sometimes I'm kind of giving this to you as I would give it to police or educators or human service people in the community, just to kind of let them know, again, 1 in 15 children exposed to domestic violence in a year. Anyone who's been involved in law enforcement or even had done work with domestic violence knows that when a police officer responds to a house for domestic violence, there's a 15 times more likely that the children in that house are experiencing child abuse. So we may go for domestic violence, but we also kind of got to look and drill down a little bit deeper. And again, certainly multiple traumas. We talk about complex trauma, the idea, again, these kids see things over and over again. You may have heard Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris and her wonderful TED Talk on regards to ACEs. And she says something which I think is pretty profound. If you're walking through the woods and there's a bear, you're activated. Your fight, flight, or freeze is activated. Your airways open up, your muscles tense up, et cetera. Your blood flows a little. And that's great because that's survival, and that's great. And there's a bear in the woods. But the question is, for a lot of our kids, what happens when the bear comes home every night? And so even though we were getting police reports, 1,350 where children were present, et cetera, how many times does abuse or neglect, et cetera, happen and the police never get called? So the numbers just were something that I thought we needed to pound in everybody's head in the community. And again, you certainly may know what all these, some of these are. Some of this may be redundant for you, or you've already seen it or heard it. But again, what it looks like at the scene for a first responder. Again, it could be the wailing, it could be inappropriate emotions, could be that 1,000-yard stare. Again, everything from physical complaints to becoming incontinent, et cetera, nausea, vomiting, et cetera, for physical and emotional. And then cognitively, people may seem confused. Children may seem confused, difficulty making decisions. They lost a train of thought. They get stuck. They kind of get preoccupied. If you ever talk to some kids about something that they've seen who've had a traumatic event. Sometimes they get very repetitious with certain words or certain describing certain events. Again, a poor sense of time. And for little kids, really sadly, they become very clingy and fussy and running around. Now, for a lot of police officers, a lot of them are parents themselves. So this kind of breaks their heart, and they can go to some of those skills that they have as parents, but that's not true of everyone. And again, so we really felt like we needed to train police officers and educators, but particularly police officers, first responders, EMS, fire, et cetera, in how to deal with kids. So let's not stand over them and lurk over them. Let's get down to eye level. Let's get on our knees, squat down, et cetera, and look for some of these certain behaviors. And then to a certain extent, as best you can, document that. And one of the things, well, because we'll get into this in a minute, but I think the other piece is it's not enough to say I identified this behavior, but what are we doing as not only at the scene in the short term in terms of building resiliency or trying to put some protective factors in with those children, but what are we also doing in the community trying to build long term? So how are we supporting parents? How are we supporting parents who may have children who are born NAS and CPS is involved and they're talking about maybe taking the kids or not? Are we supporting those parents who have had some young parents, et cetera, at-risk parents, et cetera? How are we supporting that as a community? How are we creating social connections, either with the faith community, professionally, or otherwise? And again, you can see that, this concrete support of need in times of need, and then certainly letting people understand and have a knowledge. Not everyone's as fortunate to always have a bachelor education where they studied child development. But again, that idea of letting people know, and then trying to build social emotional. I mean, if you're an educator today, I'm married to one, and I think I hear social emotional learning 10 times a day for the last 10 years. And so it's certainly something that is on people's minds. Again, we have to be cognizant that we can't always stop certain behaviors of that happen to kids, certain events or violence, but there are certainly precautionary things that we can do. And I think we need to look into that. And that's part of the training that we do. So Brockton, Mass, again, is this piece. Again, I told you a little bit about the data collection. The precipitating incident, which really got us going, was, and then I heard from a school adjustment counselor who said that a child, a 12-year-old child and a 5- and 6-year-old boy and girl, brother and sister, came into school on a Friday morning. And unbeknownst to the school and unbeknownst to anybody else, except for the police and the victims who had happened, their house had been broken into on an armed home invasion. It's a drug house ripoff. Practically knocked the door off the hinges. One set of drug dealers was looking for another. They got the wrong apartment. We have a lot of 3- and 4-story deckers, what we call 3-deckers in Massachusetts. They got the wrong apartment. In that, they pistol whipped the mother, put a gun in the 12-year-old's mouth, scared the hell out of the 5- and 6-year-old boy and girl. And even after they got taken to the emergency room and mom tried to duct tape the door, the police came back, the troopers came back and said, "We have some clothing. Could you identify it in the car?" The problem with that certainly was that now they had to go back out in the street again. But the point of the man who called me, one of the school adjustment counselors, Ed Olson, he said, "Eddie, how are we supposed to help these kids? I saw them walk in and I saw the brother holding the 5- and 6-year-old's hand. And I thought, what a good brother." And I said, "Good morning" to them. And they said, "Good morning" to me. But there was nothing that led me to believe that anything had gone on the night before, which made me start to think about, well, if I was that child and that had happened to me, I would be wondering really why no one said anything to me. Like, don't all the adults in my world know what's going on? And so I think that it begins to say, well, they don't care. Maybe I shouldn't say anything. Maybe this is my new normal, et cetera, et cetera. And that none of that was acceptable, quite frankly. And that's when we started to say, well, how often does this happen? And that's when we started to do the research. We also looked, you see Boston Medical Center, and you see a book called Children Who See Too Much, written by a woman who's fantastic. She's was chief social worker at Boston Medical Center. Her name was Betsy McAllister Groves, and she wrote this book. And she also wrote a fantastic 2-volume book with a doctor named Dr. Joy Osofsky out of, I believe it's Tulane or New Orleans anyways. OJJDP, again, if you're familiar with them, they started talking about this back in 2005, and that was right around the time we were doing that. And then Yale and New Haven were doing something that in Brockton we initiated starting in 2006 until COVID, and that was putting graduate school students, social workers riding with police officers in certain areas, certain maybe hotspot geographic areas, but also certain times of day. And if something had happened the night before that wasn't a social worker and a police officer out there, then the next day there would be a follow-up. So very similar in many ways to what you're doing with your opioid outreach. We also were very happy to partner with the folks at Harvard Law School who wrote this book called Helping Traumatized Children Learn. And they really started to take a look at what can we do in terms of schools. Now, really, when they really looked at this, initially, it was for kids who had been witnessed domestic violence and community violence, which is kind of in that wheelhouse 2005. But by 2010 and 12, we were knee deep, as I'm sure you were in many cases, in the opioid epidemic. And so, again, this was another ace that we could add to. And so this became really helpful because now we had a way to teach schools how they might identify kids, and then once they've identified them, how might they treat them differently? And then also, even if you can't identify kids, there is a culture that's built in the school. I'll tell you, we replicated this study a number of times, and it's fascinating to me that the numbers keep coming back. But in the schools that we've done the training and we have the police working with the schools, there's been a 70% decrease in suspendable offenses and a 45% decrease in office referrals. Now, I actually thought it would be the other way around, but the teachers, when we did a focus group with them, they were pretty clear, hey, we still send them down to the office, but we're not sending them down to get suspended. We're sending them down as a warm handoff. So it's an excellent book. It's free. It's online. traumasensitiveschools.org. You can get both copy. There's a copy of, how to do the initial piece in school and then how to institutionalize it across the system. I think it's great. They have some great videos, et cetera, there for you. Lastly, one of the other resources I would draw you to, the Yale Medical School, OJJDP, and the International Chiefs of Police produced this book. I want to say it's probably 7 years old, and some of the work that you're going to see, the slides you'll see later, come right from this book. They produced about 30,000 big kind of what's the word I would look for? Kind of copies of this, pretty thick, maybe 1.5 inches thick, so to speak. It's now all electronic, so you can get it. I really highly recommend it. They also have some really good, not quizzes, I guess. I would say they kind of like take surveys, if you will, surveys to say, does your department have training? How does your department handle children at the scene? How do they handle drug exposed kids? How do they do that? And if not, then, what can be some of the responses from that? It's a really excellent resource. And again, I don't think you have to look too far. It's right there. So this is, I'm not going to go through all of these because I'm cautious of the time as well. It's been about 14 minutes for me, and I think I'm going to wrap up in a couple minutes. But what we have here is what we look for is what's typical development. So we go through this with police, again, with far more detail, not in 5 minutes, but maybe in, 3 or 4 hours. If we have it, if we don't, then we'll do it at a roll call meeting, and we'll kind of give them some of these cards to look at and use that. But what's typical development, and then what's a common response that they see, particularly for infants, et cetera. And one of the things you see in the lower right is that calm, quiet, docile, glassy-eyed, almost asleep at the chaos. Again, some of those kids have seen way too much. And again, it's kind of almost their way of kind of drifting off or coping in many ways. And again, some of you who have done the trauma work, that a lot of people will reflect upon that they almost felt like an out-of-body experience. They kind of separated themselves from the event that was happening. I also am very concerned, and as I'm sure you are, the child who acts out, well, that's good because it's what's going on with that child. They're obviously angry, upset, et cetera. The child and the children I worry about are the kids who fly below the radar. You go to the scene or they go to school the next day, something might have happened, but they seem like they pretty got it under control, pretty well adjusted, et cetera. And I think sometimes we say they don't really need any help. They seem like they're doing pretty good. And I just think that sometimes we miss opportunities there. And I'm interested in hearing some input from you all. Again, we do the toddlers and typical development, and then what responses for that. And then what can first responders do in terms of, first and foremost, obviously, is creating physical safety. And then also trying to have a place where the children don't see all that's going on. So if dad or mom or whoever has to get taken into custody and has to get handcuffed, et cetera, it's best not to do that. When we first had police officers say to me, gee, we don't always put them in the police report because they didn't see anything. They weren't a witness. Then I say, officer, where were they? And they were, well, they were in the third floor in the bedroom, or they were in the second floor in the bedroom, and they didn't see anything. Do you think they heard anything? Do you think when they came downstairs and they saw you putting dad in the cruiser and mom was going to an ambulance and there was blood on the kitchen floor, do you think they saw that? So again, they may not be a witness for what exactly happened, but they certainly are that kind of collateral damage and victims, as you know very well. And again, so we get into preschoolers, et cetera, and all the different ways that we can, and we talk about child development and the cognitive behavior. What can you expect cognitively? Obviously, you're going to talk to a 4-year-old much differently than a 14-year-old or 18-year-old. And so we go through all of these, et cetera, all up to the ages. And one of the things lastly, I want to share with you, and again, we also see, again, certainly with adolescents, we see this anger and rage, and spending a lot of time in detention centers. It was clear to me that when I first worked there, I said, where does this anger and rage come from? There were kids who were so angry, who weighed 120 pounds, and it took 3 guys my size to try to contain them. And you just had to wonder, where is this rage coming from? Well, I think we know it comes from traumatic backgrounds and et cetera, et cetera. So what can first responders do? One thing that we can do is we talk about tactical breathing, trying to get a police officer. Again, they know what tactical breathing is. How do I control my breath and my heartbeat so that I can properly use my service revolver, et cetera, my sidearm, whatever, what have you. And so it's a skill that I think a lot of officers may know about, but we also think, and again, if you've done yoga or mindfulness, et cetera, it's certainly also part of that in the breathing technique. What we really like about it is, in some ways, some of you who are social workers, if I say transitional object, it's a way of you're giving the child and perhaps the parent a skill set that they have that they can use after you're gone. And in many cases, the police have been pretty happy because they've gotten some really good feedback from the parent and their children about, hey, I still, they see them on the street or in the schools. Hey, I still do that breathing thing. I still do that. It really helps me. So again, for police officers who often go to a scene, fill out a report, send the stuff to CPS, if you will, if it's a mandated reporter, and they don't get any follow-up, or they don't have any proper training in terms of how to address at the scene, I think it becomes really important and really empowering for police officers. This is my information. I work with Dan. I certainly do a lot of pro bono work as well, but I'm happy to answer any questions, talk to you, give you a lot more resources. I have a lot more PowerPoints I'm happy to share, and Dan knows that. So, Dan, I think I'm going to stop right there at 19 minutes, and I'm going to see if anyone has any questions.